Welcome to In These Times, a multi-platform podcast and YouTube broadcasting channel for mental health issues. We want to address mental pain and emotional suffering by bringing you information that can alleviate your distress. And you may make some important mental shifts that bring back your light, your love, your hope. Please use the Contact Us button on our website to let us know your deepest troubles and concerns with your mental health. Help us to help you. The last 2 years have been a period of time when many couples have reported feeling so stressed that it seriously damaged their relationships. And for many, what started as love and togetherness has crashed. Of course, there may have been quite serious differences between the couple before the pandemic and the lockdowns. But now, sadly, the lawyers who deal with divorce and separation tell us they've never been so busy. So why do relationships break down? Are unrealistic expectations from the start to blame? Well, to unpack this, I'm joined by the psychotherapist and co-founder of In These Times, Previn Karian. Previn, so let us look. When people come together, they come together with great happiness, great hopes they're going to love each other forever. So what goes wrong?
Everything. When you think about it, human beings don't think about relationships. The way we get attracted, the way we are emotionally involved with people really bypasses all our systems of thought. So everything is going to go wrong because nothing is thought about. All you're experiencing is the closeness, the comfort, the intimacy, the reassurances. And although there may be bumps along the way when you're courting, dating, prior to becoming a couple unit, the actual data of what is this relationship actually based on isn't calculated anywhere in the human brain. So we kind of propel ourselves unconsciously into these relationships. We aren't consciously registering the data. We can see what's going on. We can see the issues we will need to be talking about, but you never do, because the big need in a couple is to get out of being a single person and into this idealized, hyper-idealized, hyper-romanticized couple unit.
Well, I was just going to say, in fact, society seems to put a great store on trying to put us all into couples, everything online, women's magazines, paper. It's all about how to stop being alone, be in a couple. So I wonder if that leads to a certain sort of flimsiness and unreality, really, in forming a relationship because you want to be in one.
Yeah, it's difficult because historically there have been different reasons why couples get together. If you go back to Victorian times, a lot of people got together for economic reasons. You move into modern times, people became couples and formed couple units based on attractions and then splinter later on. So I don't think there's been any stage, certainly in the West and in democracies, where choosing your partner as opposed to an arranged marriage would actually lead the individuals to think about what does make a good relationship and is that person a right fit for me? It's only recently, with so much breakdown, that people are slowly turning towards psychology and asking for, those 10 tips of a good relationship or the 6 indicators why it could be wrong.
But it's all a hopeless case if people actually fall into love with the sex with somebody, isn't it?
Yeah, that's an attraction-based connection. It isn't going to lead to relationship. Unfortunately, you can't sustain a relationship purely on sex. You can do it if both people decide to be very independent and live separately. But when you form a couple unit, the demand that's going to be placed upon you is that you can't be that individual who just enjoys sex. You can't be that individual who just has a good time and has a date or a dinner or goes to the theatre and cinema. Something massively changes.
But the trouble is people aren't honest with each other. I mean, people can often see the problems in another person, but they just obliterate and they say, oh, no, I'm imagining, they'll go away, it'll be all right.
Yes, and this goes down to the very deep psychological problem that we project onto people the things that we deeply desire the most. And so we tend to hallucinate, basically, and imagine that the other person has all of these amazing, wonderful qualities, which they may have to a very small degree, but they're inflated out of all proportion because we come from such needy places that we're not prepared to look at the data and think, do you know what? They're not all that. They're just another human being.
Well, that would be boring, wouldn't it?
Maybe not. This is
No films would be made of that.
Well, there you have another problem, which is the commercialization of relationship, the consumerist idea that you can get the person that you want who will be ideal, as if it's like getting your ideal car or your ideal house. You get your ideal husband or wife, or partner if it's LGBTQ. And we're pumped with these ideas that romance is some magical, mystical thing that falls upon you miraculously. Now, it can happen like that for some people. But even in those situations, you have to wake up to the fabric and reality of relationship.
Well, does that mean, are you about to go on to say that things change?
Drastically, and this is the problem, isn't it? Because when you become a couple, there is nowhere to hide. And when you think about it, well, couples are meant to share. That was the whole idea of committing to the couple unit. But suddenly sharing becomes a nightmare. It becomes a hell house. And inside this hell house, all your worst characteristics and qualities amazingly start to appear, and you have no idea why. Now, the first reason that this appears is because there is nowhere to hide. So all the space that you are sharing means that you can't hide from the other person. So it's very hard then to hide even from yourself. In other words, you lose your privacy. Now, when you lose that space, that's a huge problem because now that other person can see you all the time. And there is constant visibility, you're constantly transparent, and then they see the worst parts of you.
Well, you know, if you're honest about couples, and I'm sure people watching will know what I mean, it's very rare to find a couple who are equally balanced. Usually one person is trying to have domination over the other in some way or other, and it's pitiful to watch.
That's one type of relational problem, Chrissy. I mean, there are several types in couples. The power dynamic is problematic because it creates a false sense of security. It creates massive idealization. And the power inequality, by the way, it's not about age or money or class. It's about attitudes that go on. And if one person in the relationship idealizes the power of the other person will feed into it and feel very powerful and feel very heroic or superior or strong, when they're not. They're just human beings, and they have imperfections and they have flaws. And now that you're a couple, guess what? Those are about to explode in your face.
Well, and you see people looking, this is hence the henpecked man, you see. Well, I mean, there's henpecked women too, but in any event, it's a sort of deep down rage in them that they're not getting their needs met because somebody has never met them.
Yes, and there's a great title of a book called Adult Searches for Infant Losses. So what actually happens in couples is that the needs that we didn't get met as a child for love, relationship, attention, care, nurturing, and bear in mind, none of our parents can be perfect. So all those needs that we didn't get met back then, we try to imagine that this partner is going to satisfy us. And without thinking about it, it creeps into our unconscious mind and seeps out into angry behavior. And suddenly when the partner isn't behaving the way you want, isn't giving you the attention that you want, doesn't make quite the right comments, doesn't notice this or that, doesn't give you recognition, doesn't give you the right type of valuing, you find yourself in raging explosions of anger.
Well, lots of people cope because in an ideal world, one partner goes to work or both go to work, children go to school. I mean, it's all been topsy-turvy during lockdowns and COVID, which I suspect caused even more problems, but because people have been kind of locked up together. which is not good, because when they got together, they weren't locked up together.
Yes, and that's precisely the point about couples. You lose the freedom of space. There is nowhere to hide. And of course, lockdown meant that everybody's shadow side was going to become visible. And there was no break from it. So it isn't a case that, lockdown brought families together and they all loved each other a lot more. What happened was lockdown was driving people stir-fry crazy. They were going mad. Because what happens isn't some kind of harmonious human ideal of love in the family. What happens is the unbearableness of each other starts to come out. And this is because we don't understand relationship, Chrissy. We seem to want it to be all about the way I want to see it, the way my needs have to be met. And we have no capacity for difference. And that's one of the big problems with couples, is that when you start to trigger the shadow, the demonic side of the other person that you never imagined could be in such a lovely, wonderful person, and there it is, you have to be able to talk through that shadow.
I was going to talk about communication, because communication can either come through sex or talking or both.
Well, it could come through sex, but the problem with sex is that it's a very temporary alleviation. It's almost a distraction if you've got conflict. Now, there's such a thing as hate sex, that you have sex after huge heated arguments and it's all very passionate and intense. But the bad news is you're not actually solving anything. You're not confronting the issues that are going on. And this is the next thing about couples, is that when they start to break down, they attack the other person. Okay, now psychologically, that's fatal. What you need to be doing is looking at what's triggered in you, because you are getting angry with them because of something in you. Now, that's very hard, because couples think, it's your fault. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. You didn't do the other. It's you. And there's this massive persecution of the other person. What's actually going on psychologically is that stuff inside you is coming out, and you have to look at yourself and stop attacking the other person.
Well, that's if you have the capacity to look at yourself, which many of us don't. We look for someone else to meet our needs, be they sexual or be they companionship or whatever, intellectually.
Yes, but when we reach a limit, when we know it's not working, when we perhaps go through many couple relationships, there has to be a point, a pain threshold, where you ask yourself, what on earth is my problem? My problem, not their problem, okay, not women's problem, not men's problem. What is my problem? Yeah. And that is foundational, because once you start looking at that, you start to get a better idea of how to make better decisions about relationships, rather than just the attraction, rather than just the sexual attraction, or the chemistry was great, or we share the same things. It's a case of, I'm quite an angry person, and I get angry for these reasons. And there's specific things that make me absolutely incandescent. I explode with rage. Now, why is that? And there's two things you can do at that point. You choose people who won't trigger you, or you try to get to the roots of that explosive anger and try and deal with it.
The trouble is, by the time this bad stuff sets in, there's no money, so you can't afford to separate, and you've got, more importantly, a couple of children. And the effect on them is a great worry too.
Yes, I mean, that's certainly something we'll be looking at in our parent breakdown interview, where we can unpack that a lot more. But the couple unit is very fragile. It's very different to the relationship between parents and children. Parents and children have an absolute biological connection. You see it in children given up for adoptions, the craving to know who was my biological mother, who was my biological father. And it is a form of love that cannot change. It's a kind of constant, one of the few constants in human nature, is the love that exists between a child and the parents, both parents, okay? So children have an automatic bond. It's very unconditional. They're babies. It's so easy to love them. They're not making huge demands on your freedom other than physically. And there's a fantastic bonding that goes on. Now, couples don't have that. They're not babies. Okay, you have expectations of them. And when they are not met, you get infuriated with them because they should have understood, they should know how to behave, or they should know not to do this.
So it's the luck of the draw, is it?
No, it's about choosing better. It's about knowing yourself well enough to know, oh, I'm really attracted to that person and I want to have massive sex with them. And that's going to be disastrous. It isn't always, but it's probably going to be disastrous because relationships are not founded on sexual attraction. They're founded on emotional connection. And most men nowadays and women don't know what they feel anymore. They don't have the time to feel anything about themselves. So they can think, oh yeah, that was a really great time. And it wasn't. Okay, there was something inside that was troubling you, but you haven't got time to think it all out. You're too fragile. You want to get out of being single, so you override your feelings. Now, couples, as I say, are different from children. So you might be able to love your children. Couples have to work at the relationship.
And of course, when you get together with all this love and happiness about and everybody in roses around the door, you think the person's absolutely perfect. But I think one area we ought to talk about is when you discover that one partner is abusive to you.
Yeah, well, that's a massive issue. And, we could do a series on domestic abuse. It happens increasingly to men, but it is still prevalent largely with women. We have talked about it in our interview on misogyny. And we've tried to open that out as well as psychology of the male psyche. But domestic abuse and choosing partners who are abusive, and of course that is largely something that women do and find themselves in those kind of situations, sadly resulting in deaths, sadly resulting in physical battery and abuse, sadly ending up in hospital and lying to the medical staff and saying, oh, I just slipped on a bar of soap because you're terrified of your abuser. That kind of vulnerability in couples is about protecting the person who walks into the abuse. And it's a huge task, Chrissy, and it is very, very difficult. Some of the toughest work I do is with victims of domestic abuse who will not leave their partner. They are convinced that their love is good enough, or they're terrorized. They're terrified of upsetting them, the rage, the lashing out that they will receive if they dare to leave, if they dare to empower themselves, have a voice, get out of the situation. So there are so many complex problems there. But of course, the question moving forwards is how not to choose controlling abusive people.
Yes? Well, how? How do you do that?
By knowing yourself. You can't keep blaming, for example, men for being abusive and violent and misogynist, although they generally are. And you also can't blame women for being abusive, horrid, and so on, if you're a man at the other end. Because yes, there are some women who can be extraordinarily cruel and match or exceed the cruelty of men. We've had stories recently, Chrissy, of a horrible situation where Emma Tustin was abusing a 2-3-year-old boy and it ended up in his death. So that's so counterintuitive. How can a mother or a woman kill an infant after constant abuse that is not picked up by social services? So we know that it isn't always a case that it's just men. So the question then is, what is going on in me that is so vulnerable that I still love my abuser, that I still long after them? I think and pine for them. I wonder what they're doing now. I care about them. I want to help them. And that is something about your own condition. Technically, it's called masochism.
Well, and because I think women think that they can change the man.
Yes, unfortunately, there is this strange view that love conquers all. There was a film years ago, decades ago, called Prime with Meryl Streep in it and Uma Thurman. And in the middle of the plot, which you can all look up on Netflix if it's there, at one point the mother says to her son, "Love is not enough." And then she says, "But you're probably too young to understand that." And that's the problem, that we are fed through commercial films, through Valentine's Day, through Christmas cards, through gifts and so on. We are fed the idea that love conquers all and love is everything. And certainly psychology, and particularly the Melanie Klein school would say, Wilfred Bion as well would say, no, if you just live off love, you will end up hating the person. What you need is knowledge. You need to know yourself. And if you don't know that, you're very fragile in this relationship, and it's going to be set up for massive explosions, arguments, splitting the couple container, and polarization, which, by the way, happens because two couples, the people in the couple unit end up living separate lives because of work, because of family issues and so on, and they're passing ships. So they never connect. And that's another danger with the couple's issue. The unit has to be worked at. It isn't a magical connection. It may feel like that at the beginning. It's not going to be very soon.
You know, why would you work at something after 6 years? You've got no money, the sex is off, the children are playing up, and COVID's about.
Yeah, the thing to do is to work at yourself if you can't work with the partner. Because if you decide you want to leave this relationship, if you decide you want to move on, there is no moving on if you haven't been able to psychologically ask yourself, what on earth took me into that relationship?
Well, that's a huge question, and people would like to be able to answer it for themselves, but I suspect they have to go and get some help. And I mean, help comes in the form of somebody like you, a psychotherapist, or of course, people go to Relate in Britain. And I know wherever you are in the world, you'll find organisations like Relate, where you sit down with a counsellor who tries to figure out what's gone wrong in your relationship. Sometimes successful. I mean, in Britain, the figures last year for the area called Newcastle in the north of England, 58% of clients felt their relationship was better after 1 year of talking to a counsellor. The US, you haven't fared as well at all. Your success rate was 11 to 15% after 1 year. Not sure why, but the principle is, of course, talking to another person, isn't it?
It's the third person who can help you understand the couple container and see you as a unit again, and then look at how this container split apart and got ripped apart. And the whole premise, Chrissy, of psychotherapy is to reflect on your mind, reflect on your feeling. And we could get into great philosophical discussions now about what is reflecting. Is it the consciousness? Is it a deep part of our inner self or whatever? But reflection, if you keep it a simple word, reflect on your mind in the relationship. It is the mind that keeps the couple unit together. And yeah, it's a self-reflective process. It's about self-awareness. You used the word honesty earlier. It's not enough to be honest. You can be honest and say, yes, you really made me angry. I'm being honest. No, reflect on your anger. What triggered you to be that angry with the other person?
Well, it's very complex, and I'm sure people like you and Relate have all this because, you know, if you're unhappy in a relationship, maybe you watched your parents be unhappy and that it was the way it went and that you were expected to stay in something.
Yeah, and I think we are in a time of human evolution because increasingly both men and women and LGBT partners are not going to put up with abusive relationships. They are going to have a sense of dignity, self-worth, and this has come through education processes where they can think. They know they have a mind of their own, and they're not going to stay in highly abusive or toxic relationships.
No, they aren't. But the trouble is they go straight on to a second or even a third or fourth relationship, and the figures would show us they aren't better.
No, and that's why moving on, as I said earlier, isn't a moving on. You don't move anywhere. There is nowhere to go to. There is nowhere to move on to. The only thing you can move on is inside yourself. And that's the secret of the couple. It's the couple unit brings out all the nastiness inside you. Jung famously called it the shadow that happens in the marriage relationship. I mean, he got quite sophisticated about it and called it an alchemical relationship. And what he said was that if you stay in it, all this dross, all this horrible aggression transforms. If you stay in it, will transform you. Now, that's a very ideal position, and we don't have that kind of psychological maturity. As you say, a year in therapy, in couples therapy, may help you to get that Jungian transformation. But it is about staying with opposites. It's about trying to confront differences and ask yourself, why can I not love this person for their difference? Why am I hating them? Why am I getting so angry? Why am I wanting to yell, scream, shout, and abuse them? That's when you need to look at yourself.
The problem is you do that and you very cleverly come to the conclusion that they were wrong in the first place, or they're wrong now, or what if they do eat too much, drink too much, beat you up, whatever it is. But they don't get out of it because they can't afford to.
Economic reasons, as I said, could be one of the reasons why couples get together. They're not so much the reasons nowadays, but you can end up in that trap. And that's definitely the case where, for example, particularly with women who want to leave domestic abuse situations, they are highly financially vulnerable, especially if they have children. So it requires a huge amount of internal psychological strength and practical support for them to get out. Now, nobody, if they can in any way get out, then nobody should stay in an abusive, particularly a violent or a mentally abusive relationship. And they do need to try and get some help. There are several charities that help with domestic abuse, but there is also the police. This is a very high-level intervention that couples hate doing, okay? Because you're then bringing the law, the force of the law, to stop the other person. But unfortunately, that is all you can do at that point. And then at least that person is now having to manage their behaviour because they're under surveillance. And if there's any evidence to the contrary that they've carried on, that they haven't changed or at least restrained their rage, then that person has serious consequences. So it can work. But I mean, this is all, papering the cracks. It's not a substantial solution.
It sounds quite a gloomy chat we've had, really, but there are some happy couples about, I think. And, we have to rejoice in that fact. But life is hard, and what starts very nicely, problems just mount up. And for many people now, having had sickness over their heads is a real worry, and financial problems. It's been a dreadful time, hasn't it?
Yeah, but I'll go back to the attachment theory school of therapy and their mantra, life without feeling is death. And couples cannot live off money, alone. They can't live off love alone. They can't live off just trying to deal with the pressures of modern day life, which is essentially about paying bills and keeping your job. It's about feelings. And it's your feeling for the other person. And if that's blocked, ask yourself, what am I doing with my feelings?
Okay, last big question. So what does make the ideal couple?
No such thing, Chrissy. And this is precisely the difficulty. The ideal couple is a fiction. We want to believe in magic. We want this wish fulfillment, that it's there. And happiness, which is an interesting word you used earlier. Couples that stay together because they've chosen to stay together have done so not because of all their wealth, not because they had life easy. They stayed together because the feeling was protected. And when you have that feeling, and when you have this ability to say, it's just me being irritable, being malicious, being vindictive, I don't want to carry on like this. I want to change because I love this person. I like them. That's the kind of self-transformation that keeps the couple unit together. And you do it because, dare I say it, you love the person.
Yes.
But love won't change anything. It's the knowledge of yourself. Self-knowledge is the key to couples.
I know. I'm glad you brought the word love up, because I was keenly aware that we hadn't touched on it a lot, which is very sad, but it does exist. And thank you for talking about it.
You're welcome, Chrissy. Thanks. Bye.
In These Times is entirely based on your participation and your involvement. Please use the Contact Us button on the website to let us know your thoughts. Please also make a donation so we can go on bringing you more broadcasts. Help us to help you.